Do weapons of war belong in the hands of ordinary citizens? Should the government consider banning certain types of powerful firearms, such as semi-automatic weapons or weapons commonly referred to as assault rifles? Should the government consider other, even more drastic measures, perhaps limiting magazine capacities or even banning handguns altogether? And why do some of us resist these types of measures so fervently? Why is there still opposition even to what many would regard as entirely reasonable gun regulation? Is it politics or political tribalism? Is it because of the influence of powerful lobbying groups like the National Rifle Association? Or is there something more important, more fundamental behind this resistance? Many people, arguably well-meaning, believe that more gun regulation is the obvious answer to the plague of gun violence in our country. And every time there is yet another horrific shooting, they not only push for more gun regulation, but they act as if those of us who oppose such efforts are somehow reckless or foolish. So, why is there such a huge disconnect between people on this issue? And why are some of our citizens so adamant in their opposition to almost any new regulation on firearms? To answer this question, one has to ask, what was the purpose of the Second Amendment? This is not a question that most people, including many of our leaders and educators, can answer adequately. They haven't been taught the history behind the Second Amendment, nor do they really understand the important purposes that it serves. What, for instance, would the founders have thought about politicians that say things like, "Weapons of war don't belong on our streets"? Would they have agreed with this sentiment? Did the founders, in fact, believe that ordinary citizens were not to be trusted with military-style weapons? Fortunately, the founders left us plenty of evidence of their thoughts on this topic, and even a brief review of their writings can provide a clear answer to this question. Informed by history and by their own experiences, the founders understood the danger of having too much power concentrated in a central government. One feature of that centralized power that they feared was the existence of so-called standing armies in peacetime. The founders believed that standing armies could be weaponized by tyrants to persecute people. Thus, an armed citizenry was supposed to serve as a check and balance on this potential tyranny. Too many of our leaders today not only fail to realize this, but they also mock those of us who believe that an armed citizenry plays at least some role in preventing tyranny. Of course, the founders didn't think this notion was ridiculous at all, and this was clearly the main reason they included the Second Amendment in the Constitution. Madison, Jefferson, Washington, and many other leaders from that era supported the concept of an armed citizenry. And this was not just embraced on the national level either. Almost every state constitution from that era had provisions similar to the Second Amendment. And even those founders that favored a stronger central government understood that it was still important for ordinary citizens to have firearms at their disposal. One good example of this is Alexander Hamilton's arguments in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton lays out his vision for an armed citizenry in Federalist number 28 and number 29. Though he favored a strong central government, more so than, say, James Madison or Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton still wanted to address the concerns that some of his contemporaries had for standing armies and too much power concentrated in a federal government. Hamilton's solution to this was that ordinary citizens should be allowed to possess military-style firearms. The idea was that ordinary citizens would be able to develop such a familiarity with firearms that they could be called upon to serve in a state's militias as needed. This would in turn not only serve as a check and balance on the power of the federal government and its military, but it would also allow the states and the people to supplement the new nation's capacity for self-defense. Private gun ownership and familiarity with military-style weapons ensured that ordinary citizens could still contribute to the defense of the nation without having to devote as much time to martial pursuits as would be required of professional soldiers. This also served an economic purpose in that fewer citizens would need to be pulled away from their ordinary occupations to serve in the military. The nation could thus benefit from the services of a professional army as well as an army of ordinary citizens. Now, this reasoning clearly contradicts the oft-repeated claim that the Second Amendment was only meant to protect state militias. This was clearly not the case. The idea and purpose of the Second Amendment was to have individuals in possession of firearms, and such firearms that would allow them to provide for the defense of the nation when needed. Some might argue that, in the modern context, this calculus has completely changed. After all, state militias no longer factor much in the defense of this country, and some think that the immense power of the U.S. military renders any resistance to it futile. As an example, Joe Biden once said that if you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something more than a gun. But statements like this demonstrate a failure to understand the benefit of having armed citizens. People who make this kind of argument are only thinking on a very shallow surface level. An armed citizenry need not have parity with its country's military in order to serve as an effective check and balance. Those of us who support the Second Amendment don't have any delusions that we'll one day have it out with the U.S. military, nor would we want such an outcome. But to suggest that an armed citizenry doesn't serve as at least some kind of deterrence to tyranny is a failure to understand the complexities of the issue. Unarmed citizens are clearly much easier to oppress and more likely to fall prey to a government that is tempted to exercise illegitimate power. To some degree, armed citizens help alleviate that temptation. There's a reason every great tyrant in history insisted on disarming its citizens. Tyrants understand that it takes more time, effort, and resources to subjugate a people that is armed. That is why disarmament is usually a prerequisite to subjugation. Once disarmed, a population is much easier to manage and control. History is full of examples of oppressed peoples that were armed enough to defend themselves against tyrants that were more powerful and more well-armed. The American victory in the Revolution was itself an improbable outcome that was helped in part due to the access to firearms. But the opposite is also true. Countless horrors have been visited upon people that were disarmed. Once disarmed, a citizenry is utterly helpless and unable to resist almost anything imposed upon it. That is why Americans should never tolerate such a situation here. And if there's any truth to the argument that there is such a great imbalance between the arms possessed by our citizens and those possessed by our military, then the solution is certainly not to disarm our people even more. Rather, if we're following the principles and philosophy of the founders, then perhaps our people ought to be allowed to arm themselves with even more powerful weapons. Perhaps we've already gone too far down the road of gun control, and the result is a system that is out of balance from the one that our founders envisioned. Of course, then, tyranny was not the only thing that our founders feared. The individual right of self-defense was also one of the purposes of the Second Amendment, and specifically the need for self-defense in those instances where government showed itself unable or unwilling to fulfill its duty to protect its citizens. The founders were well acquainted with examples from history where disarmament or selective enforcement of various disarmament efforts left certain populations in danger of abuse at the hands of their neighbors. Such was the case in England just before the Glorious Revolution of the 1680s. King James had tried to disarm certain parts of his population such that they could be persecuted by other parts of the population. This was not lost on the founders when they drafted the Second Amendment. This was also a sad reality for certain oppressed groups here in the United States. Firearms played an important role in assisting those who were not always so well served by their government. Certainly, we've seen some of that in our own time as well. Some examples from recent history remind us that governments are not always willing or able to stop the purveyors of evil from doing harm to innocents. In those instances, firearms are essential to our citizens exercising their right to self-defense. Americans would do well to remember that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right, and it is as important as all our other rights. We should not allow this right to be continually encroached upon. And a government that doesn't trust its people with the right to bear arms is a government that doesn't deserve its people's trust.